few months ago, I decided to try this really tiny little miniature book. I've done miniature books before, but this is much smaller. And I used some scrap leather that I had, a Grickel type leather, which I've done some more of recently. This one was just a blank book, but because I had some more scrap leather from these books that I did recently, I thought it would be fun to do another one and maybe make a video of it. However, this time around I decided to try it with a text. Now, this isn't perfect, but I got the idea of formatting my already miniature A8, I think, edition of John's Gospel to make it even smaller. So I didn't actually typeset it again. I simply imposed the A4 pages as if they were A6. And it turned out that it worked. Now, I might have probably got a better quality if I had actually typeset it anew, but I wasn't going to spend all that time. But it did actually work, and it is sort of just about readable. Well, the text is readable. I had to use a magnifying glass to work out the page numbers sometimes. So in this video, I really then show how I found this little tiny book. It's really a fun project. It's not exactly a tutorial because I do some things that I don't really feel ready to give instruction on, or else would require a lot more background. But I thought you might enjoy seeing it. So the first step basically is, it's rather a pain, but cutting it all up, which I did in the way I've shown for other books. Miniature books are always a bit tricky to get the registration right, and of course the smaller they are, the more you notice anything that's off. And I discovered after I'd cut these that some of the margins were not exactly accurate. Nothing got cut off, but they're not perfect. But nevertheless, it did sort of work all right, I think. It was a bit tricky also because I had to make sure I wasn't getting the pages mixed up. Normally it's easy to see the page number, but with this it wasn't quite so easy. So my first step was to cut each page into, well, first the A4 sheets into A5 and then A6. The A6 basically ends up being what A4 would have been. And then A7 has the whole of one signature because I had 16 pages per signature. So once I've got my A7 pages cut, yes, A7 pages cut, those are basically my signatures that I will then cut up into 4 sheets that will give me 16 pages per signature. So I'm just doing that, being as precise as I can, although as I say, trying to get printers to align things properly. I mean, it's possible I could play around more to improve this, but it got a bit confusing after a while, and it's not really something I'm going to focus on much more. And then once the signatures or the pages are all cut, the sheets are all cut, I'll fold them. As I said, I've got 16 pages in each signature, so there'll be 4 signature or sections or quires, whatever you prefer. So there'll be 4 sheets in each signature, and I think there are, can't remember now, I think there are 11 or 12 signatures in the book. And before I stitch the book, I'm going to press these briefly. So I do what I normally do and alternate the pages so the folds are on different sides. As I said, it's really a bit tricky with such tiny things to get them to behave and stay on top of each other. But I press those, and then while they're in the press, I also I'm going to quickly make some end pages. I'm using a piece of paste paper that I had made, at least I can't remember if I made it or it's like the one I made in a previous video, so I'll link to that. So I'm doing a simple made end page, like similar to the ones I've shown before, and then I'm going to stitch them. But yeah, I'm just using PVA here, and it's actually thicker than I would normally do, and I could have had a bigger brush, but yeah, I was just doing it quickly. So I carefully align those, and then I'll press them and let them dry before stitching them on. Once my signatures have been pressed, I check that they're okay and align them correctly. And then I also trim my end pages, which are now dry, and they're made end pages, so they'll form effectively the front and the back signatures of the book. So I cut those to size, and then before I stitch the book, I need to punch my holes. So I do that using a template, and yeah, basically punching the holes in each signature. I've shown processes like these in my case binding series and elsewhere. It's probably easier to learn from that, because this was really very fiddly. So yeah, this isn't really a tutorial as such, and some of this took me much longer than I'd expected, because it was a bit tricky. Maybe one gets used to working with such small things, but it wasn't the easiest thing to do. Anyway, so those all get punched. And then once my holes are all punched, I simply have to stitch my book block. I'm stitching it with a French link stitch here, which is a bit different from what I've shown in most of my videos, like the case binding series. I think I did this in my video on binding a Christmas Carol a couple of months ago. So that might be a better place to see how I do it if you're interested, because this was really tiny and fiddly. But basically, instead of going around a band in the middle of the signature, I come out of it, and then I go, I stitch under the stitch below and join the signatures in that way, and then go back in. And then, of course, at the head and the tail, they are kettle stitches, which also hold it together. Yeah, so I basically stitch my book block, and the end pages also then are stitched in, because they're made end pages, so they effectively form the first and the last signatures. If anyone is interested, I've actually decided to put the PDF that I did for this, that is of the imposed A10 signatures. I'll make it available for free if anyone would like to try it themselves. It's, as I said, it's not absolutely ideal, because it's an imposition of an imposition. But yes, I was able to use it. So if anyone else feels like having a go at this, I'll leave the link below. I am still working on my digital products that unfortunately have been a bit stalled. Yes, I'm also working on reorganizing my website and shop and everything else. So I think I'll put this on Ko-fi. I have recently also started a Ko-fi account for anyone who's interested in supporting the making of videos. I'm trying to do it more regularly, although I'm afraid the last few weeks haven't been too great. My idea was to try every 2 weeks, but yeah, last couple of weeks that didn't happen. But yes, obviously the more support I get, the more videos I'll be able to make. And yes, and I hope it won't be too long before I have some more digital products up as well, and some more news about that. But in the meantime, yes, I'll just make this file available for free for anyone who would like to try it. And then once the book block is stitched, what I'm doing with gluing it is a bit different to what I've shown before in videos, because I'm planning to back this book as well as round it. I haven't shown that before, and it's actually only something I've started doing fairly recently. But because of that, I'm doing it a bit differently. So I place the book block flat between boards, and I'm not using mel at this stage, but I simply apply a coat of PVA to the spine carefully, and then let it dry like that. Once the book is dry, I'm going to round it and back it. So I first measure and draw a line at the width of the board away from the spine. This isn't really a tutorial on backing. As I said, it's only something I've started doing recently, and I don't really feel ready to teach anything much about it. But I have found that it's useful for some books. And the reason I decided to do it for miniature books is really mainly an aesthetic one. That, if one has a hinge groove, the width of the groove is sort of disproportionate to the size of such a small book. So that's why I'm opting to back this. I don't have proper backing boards, but I have discovered that I can back books simply with beveled boards that I use. And it is a bit fiddly trying to, with such a small book, trying to get it to line up properly, and then manage to clamp it together. So that, as I say, that was a bit fiddly, but I seem to have managed eventually. And then what I did was to just place a damp cloth on it for a minute or so, just to help to soften the glue. And then it's really just a case of glancing blows to basically make the shoulders. That's the idea is, or at least for this one, it was my intention to have roughly 90-degree angles on the shoulders. So you can find more about backing somewhere else, and when I feel more proficient, I might do something more on it. And then once it's backed, I apply another coat of glue just to hold the shape in place, and I'll then leave that to dry. And when the book is dried, I am speckling the edges. I've shown this in another video, and it's something I do often simply because it's about the easiest form of edge decoration I know. So I'm just using acrylic paint, watered down acrylic paint, various colors, until I get the effect that I like. I'm now just going to start with paring my piece of leather. Working with leather is something that I have, when I first started the channel, I said I wasn't going to do anything about leather, although of course that's what people want to know about when it comes to binding. Partly, and my reason for that is partly because I'm really self-taught when it comes to leather. I'll say more about that again. And I also don't really have access to proper bookbinding leather, and so I had a bit of an imposter syndrome, which I tend to have with lots of things, and veered away from it. But I've realized that probably the situation I was in is one that a lot of other people are also in, and possibly my experience might be helpful. So I do intend saying more about how I work with leather in another video. But for now, I'm using a safety beveler here. There are various ways of thinning the leather that I use, but for this, I'm just doing this. And I'll say more about leather again. And what I'm doing here also is just making a leather headband. This is a piece of the same leather that I had pared very thin. and I just glue it around a piece of string. And once the headband is dry, I will then simply glue it on the head and the tail bands. I'll simply first of all measure the spine, and then cut the head and the tail bands and glue them on to my book block. And once my headbands, whatever, are both attached, now here I could have actually put a piece of paper or something in between them to just make it more even, but I wasn't really too bothered for case binding. So I didn't do that. But what I do now is that I glue a piece of, this is actually a piece of muslin that I glue over glue onto the spine, but going over the head and the tail band. So the muslin comes, it's just slightly shorter than the book block, and it protrudes. This one is actually uneven. I'll need to trim it later, but it protrudes on the sides. And once the spine is dry, I measure it again to measure the width of the spine board, which I'm just using a piece of cardstock type of board. So I measure it from the one edge of the spine to the other, and then my front and my back boards I've also measured so that they protrude just slightly. The nice thing with backed books is that you can get quite an accurate sense of where the boards go. So I then just trim my spine board. And I then take my piece of leather, which I had roughly pared. So I'd sort of, because really with working with leather, the crucial thing is that you do need to have it suitably thin in the right places. So particularly at the hinges and also with the turnovers and the corners. So having got my more accurate measurements, I then check all this and mark it out. And it turns out that I am going to need to thin off the hinges a little bit more. And then I also just sand the edges and the corners of the board slightly, just to make sure they aren't too sort of pointy. So I'm now ready to make my cover. I've measured everything out, and so I basically just I start with the spine board and basically glue that, and then the boards, making sure to line everything up very accurately. That's important with anything, but particularly with a miniature book. So because this book is backed, I've got a much smaller hinge gap than I would normally have, basically about 2 millimeters, or the width of my boards. Obviously the width of the boards can vary, but that's what I'm doing now. As I said, I'm using PVA. For this sort of thing you could use paste, and some people would certainly say it would be better, but for my purposes PVA is easier for this. Obviously, as you can see, this is just a case bound book. A lot of leather binding is actually done differently, but just the sort of things I do tend to be easier to do case binding with. So I basically make sure that everything is well lined up, and then I apply glue around the edges and do the turn-ins. The nice thing about working with leather is that it is malleable, particularly in comparison to book cloth. The corners can be, there are various ways of doing the corners. I tend to do a sort of a pleated one, or it really depends on my leather. And this is also where it is very helpful if you have your leather pared very thin. But as I said, the leather is malleable, so you can tend to work it to get the effect that you want. And so once I've used my bone folder to really finish it off nicely, I'll then basically put it between boards and let it dry a while. And once the cover's dry, I'll check it. And then the last thing I do before casing the book is to, well, the second last thing, is to just tidy up the leather of the turn-ins, because it will inevitably be not absolutely straight. So I'll remove excess leather, and then I also add I can't remember if there's a name for this, but a piece of cardstock to fill in the space, just so that there won't really be much of a mark under the end page, because leather is generally thicker than paper or book cloth, so it's to avoid a sort of ridge there. So I cut my pieces of cardstock to size, and then I'll simply glue them in there. One thing to note is that here I'm going to glue them both on the cardstock itself and also apply glue to the cover, because you can get a certain pull either inwards or outwards, because the more layers, well, the more glue or the type of glue or the layers of paper or whatever sort of lining you have tend to pull the board in one direction or the other. So that's just something one gets a feel for, but that's the reason why in this case I'm putting glue on both sides, so that this doesn't add to any pull one way or the other, because I've already glued my leather on the outside, and then I will also have the end page glued on the inside, so hopefully it will be even. So I basically just work these down well and let them dry for a while. And the book is now basically ready to case in. There's just one thing I'm going to do first, and that is to just, it might not be absolutely necessary, but I tend to do it, and that's just to trim off a slither of paper on the edge of the end of the paste down of the end pages. The reason for that is that it's when paper is damp, it expands in the width. So that's just really to avoid my paste down, or to counteract rather any expansion in my paste down. So I'm just doing that quickly, and then I'll be ready to case my book block. So to case the book, to start, I just slightly, with my fingers, slightly round the spine board so it'll go round easily. And then it's similar to what I do for what I show in my Casebound series, but it's slightly different in that I first will glue down my piece of muslin at the edge, because that hasn't been glued down yet. So I just apply glue under it, and then I work it down, and also just make sure that the muslin is worked into the shoulder, so that I have a shoulder of roughly 90 degrees. Then I'll basically do what I normally do and apply glue to the end page, and I then place my book block into the cover. This is slightly different because of the shoulder, so that the shoulder basically sits over the board, and then I repeat the process. I realized afterwards that my measurements for the spine board were probably a little bit too generous. I tend to be scared of making it too narrow, but actually I find that with back books, it does work better if it really just hugs the book really well. This one was a little bit too wide. It was all right, but it could have been a bit tighter. And then I just make sure it's all right. And I then will put wax paper between the end pages and press it. I had a bit of a problem again with it being such a tiny thing to fit it between boards and not have it sort of slipping out. And you really just want the boards to go to the edge of the books, of the covers boards, so that you're not applying pressure to the actual shoulders. I've realized that with miniature books it's easier to just use a clamp to press them than to try and put them in the press itself. But nevertheless, it was still a little bit fiddly. But eventually I managed, and then I just left that to dry. And here we have it the next day. It was really a fun project, but I am quite pleased with it. As I said, it's not absolutely perfect. Well, the text wasn't really, although I think the text is actually not bad for such a tiny thing. And my spine measurements could have been better, but yeah, it still opens and closes pretty well. So yes, that's my fun little miniature book. So as I said, I will put the file up if anyone would like it. I'll put a link in the comments, at least in the description. And yeah, that's it. So if you've appreciated the video, please like and subscribe, etc., and share it. And if you would like to support the making of any more videos, either once off or in an ongoing way, I'll also put a link to my Ko-fi account. But more on that again, and so basically thanks for watching.